when Mary Ellen suggested that I do a session this morning, she said, well, just cover adult learning theories and learning communities and best practices. I said, well, sure. 75 minutes, that's plenty of time. So I had been giving a great deal of thought to not knowing the audience in terms of what do you already know, what are you already working in terms of theories about adult learning and development. Clearly, you're already involved in best practices. So I see this session as more of a guided conversation to help all of us share together what it is that we've been learning so far about good practices working with adult learners, and to kind of ease our way into some of the theories of adult learning and development. And I'm going to count on anybody in the audience who knows theories to share that with us, so that when we leave, we've learned something more about theories, that especially those that have some utility in our practice. I love theory. I'm also quite a practical person, and I like theories that I can go do something with, that I can help me better understand my program or my work with students, or help me make some kind of shake up my thinking a little bit and maybe make some revisions. So I realized on the plane over here that I have been working in adult higher education for 40 years, and I find that startling. And I'm still very much a student of adult learning theories and development, and very much continuously learning something new about what it involves working with adult students and how to do that effectively. So we're going to all be sharing those perspectives together. Here's my plan for the hour or so that we have together. I have distributed some questions that I wanted you to just take a few minutes and jot down some responses. A couple of you were kind enough to hand those in already, so if you want it back, let me know if you want to refer to what you wrote. I have more copies. Try to weave some of your responses into our conversation. Just hold on to them, right? So what I wanted, and what we're doing with the questions that you've been making brief notes about, I think of as creating some kind of collective text, because we didn't have a pre-reading. I didn't do a needs assessment to find out what do you already know and what do you do with what you know. So this is going to be our quick and dirty collective text when you start sharing your responses. I want to introduce you to Donald Pratt's 5 Perspectives on Teaching and Learning in Adult and Higher Education. So how many of you are familiar with Donald Pratt's work? Okay, then good. That's one takeaway. Okay, we're gonna move into that relatively quickly. That, I think, will, once we get into looking at Pratt's perspective, that will generate ideas and conversations for what I call promising practices. It looks like they're going to work, that they be effective, and then, of course, it's always dependent on the context and how well we deliver. And then somehow we are going to segue into looking at some of the key theories, approaches from adult learning and development that have some loose connection with these perspectives on teaching and learning. But first, I think that it's important to, before we start looking at theory from a distance, to be having a sense of ourselves. What are our own behaviors, beliefs, and intentions when it comes to teaching or program design, curriculum design? So that's why I'm starting with Pratt's work. And then to the age-old question, well, so what? And what next? Do you have any questions or about where we're headed? Anything you thought we would be doing that we're not yet? Anything they want to. It starts with that student. Yeah.
I want my students to utilize the resources that I provided them. I want them to know how to use those resources and to be able to use them themselves.
Know how to use resources. You provide them, and then you want them to use them. Okay. And is that an indicator of success for you? Can use.
I want my students to be able to take the theories and the best practices that they're learning about and connect it to their prior experiences or their current experiences as educational professionals.
Connect prior to current, prior experience to current material. Another one, Sandra?
I would like my students to be able to be reflective and to think critically as adult learners. Because I believe that adult learning is developmental.
Yes.
Narrate theories and models which we use in management to the practical working experience.
Okay. What about anybody else in terms of how do you know that, how did I write? How and when do you know that your teaching has been successful?
I'm going to build on the other one and lead into that thing. What I want is the students can connect theory to practice. And so the success is, do they know why they made the professional decision that they do?
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
Again, back to that academic advising with the undercard students. Once they pick a program and make that decision and then hopefully move on, do well, graduate from that program.
Yes. Okay, what about the question that has to do with values? What core values guide your approach to teaching? Now, I may be putting, as you'll see in a minute, I may be putting these in a place where you might disagree, so it can change. Student-centered active learning. That's a value that you hold. Okay, any other values?
I'd like to promote social responsibility.
Pardon?
Social responsibility.
Okay.
My personal values, and that is a desire to see anybody succeed and accomplish what they can and want to.
Okay, thank you. And what about other than teacher, what other terms or words would you use to describe your role? I guess he's waiting.
Motivator.
Motivator?
I answered with 3 different answers. First being support system, the second being listener, and the third being comfort zone.
Having returned to college as an adult student myself, I consider myself a role model.
I just put in one more. This was from something we were discussing at breakfast in relation to prior learning assessment, but also to make sure that instructors and professors understand that, you know, they think about their instructional role, they think about their teaching role, but a good half of what you are doing is evaluating and giving feedback. And so that skill set is just as important as what you're teaching is, are you a good evaluator and a good assessor?
Right. Yeah.
I'd like to follow on with that. I think one of the important roles, particularly at the higher level, is establishing expectations that as you come up the ladder, you don't really understand the rigor of what's required of you at the higher level. I think that's an important part of what we do.
So is that part of being a role model or the evaluator? Uh-huh. Yeah, that progression and then the rigor that, okay, great, thank you. I watched YouTube, Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K, something to do with leadership. Has anybody seen Sinek? Well, it's on one of those marvelous 8-minute YouTube segments, and he's talking to an audience of leaders and salespeople, but I felt that he was talking to me, because his basic notion that we, and I'm putting myself in the context of me as the teacher, educator, when we're developing our courses, designing our programs, developing the curriculum, how quickly the conversation often turns to what are we going to do and what are students going to learn and how are we going to deliver it. And Sinek kept coming back to why. What is the purpose? What are the outcomes? What's the real passion behind what you're trying to accomplish? And so it has made me pause and think about this really core question of why are we involving students in the curriculum and the programs that we do, or in the kinds of learning activities that we do? What are the beliefs, our own beliefs and intentions that are behind that why? And and the value of pausing every now and then to pay attention to that, so that hopefully there's going to be better alignment between why we're doing something, the why behind our programs, what it is we're having students learn, how they're learning it, how we're delivering it. So this is just a very stark reminder of getting really clear about purpose and mission. And how I see this connecting with Donald Pratt's work is that, now this is a handout, so Donald Pratt and his associates have done extensive research on teaching faculty. In fact, they have a teaching perspectives inventory, which is free online, and the site for that is on the handout that's coming around. When you take that perspectives inventory, you get a very interesting profile of yourself along the lines of, and I'll talk about them in a minute, 5 perspectives. And part of the feedback that you get on that inventory has to do with, what do I think I do? How well is this aligned with my intention? And what's my basic belief in order to have this perspective? So it's a self-awareness tool for any of us who are teaching and designing programs. And I think also can help us think about where are we likely to, what theories of adult learning and development are we likely to find most appealing. So Pratt and his associates now have data on thousands and thousands of participants, So if you go, and this is free. You can go do this free, and you can look at your own profile compared to thousands of others. But the basic notion about Pratt is that there are 5 perspectives. And these perspectives have to do with, as I've got on the diagram here, the relationship between the learner, the content, the teacher, and what are the ideals. So we've got transmission. And this, he says, that transmission is basically relying on the teacher is transmitting the content. And the student's job is to get that content. But it's transmitted. So if you take it to the extreme, if you've heard of Paulo Freire's work on the banking concept, we're open ahead, we're pouring in depositing the information. Students are supposed to remember that information and give it back in some varied form. And I don't mean to say anything really negative about any of these perspectives because they all have a place depending on the learning situation and the context. But it has to do primarily with relationships. So in the transmission perspective, there's a primary commitment to the content. That is the role of the teacher, is to get that content into the student's heads. Apprentice is a way of sitting beside the student, of initiating the student into a set of social norms and ways of working. So some of the arts operate that way, where there's much more of the teacher models, student experiments, much more of a close, hands-on kind of connection. And are any of you working in that kind of apprenticeship setting? Sandra, what is yours?
They're believing at the moment, and then start to look at all of the other belief systems and think about developmentally how their thoughts are changed and how they're getting to new ideas with new information.
So you're doing that by sitting with them in concert together. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, sharing
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Can be.
good experience.
Right. Did people hear that about dissertation experience where it's like an apprentice kind of very one-on-one situation? Yeah.
Would this include a more collective thing like a methods course in education?
Same one.
Well, you are modelling different strategies and then as they go forth and practice them, and then you get some feedback on how well they did. And
Yeah, I would say so, yes. That the notion of modeling, whether it's research methods or critical thinking skills, and you're doing that with some either individually or in a group context, that they're coming back, you're processing that together, giving feedback. I think that is sort of in education a form of apprenticeship. Yes.
I teach foundations of graphics, so once we've gone over principles and elements and process of design, they all sometimes just get stuck with transmitting that with their software and creating their designs. So sometimes I'm just stuck with them while they're working on design.
Good. Yes.
Executing.
Good. Good example of apprenticeship. So the relationship. Go ahead.
Like, I'm a foreign language instructor by trade, and there's an adage that you can't teach foreign languages without also teaching culture. And so there's always a strong culture content, and so social norms and the ways of working innately fits into that.
Right, social norms. Then there's the perspective that he calls developmental, so that effective teaching is focused on the learning and growth of each student, and emphasis is on the development of higher order skills. So the relationship then is using the content as a vehicle to help students develop those higher order skills. It could be any content. It's what Sandra has said, development of critical thinking skills, the inquiry skills that you talked about here, being able to take graphic design principles and actually put them into practice without having to follow the formula or the recipe. So these are not mutually exclusive, but Pratt would say that each of us really has a primary perspective and then possibly a backup, but that's operating consciously or not so consciously as we're teaching and designing our curriculum and program. And then he says there's nurturing, which is a cousin of developmental, but here it is that the relationship between teacher and student is one of helping the students to develop a greater sense of self-agency. You talked about motivating. Helping the student to develop confidence in oneself and abilities to learn, so that the teacher is taking on very much of a coach, support. Yeah.
I think helping them learn regulation, self-regulation is a big part of it too. One thing that in online classes I often find is students just get hysterical. And, so I tell them, to calm down. Mm-hmm. And that's even become institutionalized in my classes, that students will ask me for a chill pill. I need a chill pill. Then I'll give them a little bit of a, it's okay, it's going to be all right. That's my new way of thinking about nurturing now. Chill pill.
I just wanted to say, when you mentioned the self, that Keegan talked about only there's 1/2 to 2/3 students coming back to college who really don't have a developed self. And so I think that when we go into teaching, recognizing that developmentally, that nurturing is so important to start the work of a person understanding who they are and developing a self.
And then there's the fifth perspective is that he calls social reform. And here the intent is that the teacher's primary goal is to work with students to help change society in better ways. So it might be using the content and then to critique it, using that content as a way to help critique society, critique the status quo, challenge the isms in our society or around the world, and it has a social action agenda to it.
I think that's one of the most beautiful things about adult learning is the social action. I think in adult learning, as we work with them to understand themselves, who they are, and their place in society, and that critical thinking comes into play, and then they can be good citizens and make good decisions, because now we're in a global environment that we need to be able to do those kinds of things.
What I'd like you to do is just take 3 minutes and just turn to maybe 3 people and just share with each other, what would you say is your primary perspective? of the 5 that we just covered. And then if you might have a backup. And then I'm going to be looking for some examples. Just 5 minutes.
As usual, but all 3 of us fell into the nurturing category.
Counselor, all of you? Different schools. Okay. So not surprising probably that if you're in a counseling role that you would be driven by a nurturing. Better that than this, right? What else? Are these just nice labels to play around with, or do you see any raising any questions or insights for yourself?
Is this on? One thing that we talked about in our group was a kind of combination between developmental, nurturing, and social reform. Okay. Developmental, I'm a faculty member, so really working with faculty to understand that adult learners come to us ready to learn, but that learning process is developmental, and to be able to understand the steps in that developmental process may look different from learner to learner. My colleague here, Mr. Smith from Valdosta, talked about nurturing as being an important component of the learning process, that being an encourager and understanding how to help people make transitions, and then social reform, because a college degree is a conduit to upward social mobility if it's done well and correctly.
So social reform in that you might be providing access and opportunity for that person to advance that they might not have otherwise.
Providing an opportunity for that person, but also looking from a more broad and systemic perspective, changing business, so that society begins to look at ways to provide economic uplift for people who might not otherwise have that opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the apprentice. It's got here about social norms and ways of working, but being an apprentice is also how you do your professional job, not just the social aspects of it. And a lot of these are worded very socialist,
very social
perspective. Is there any reason for that?
I don't know the reason for that, except that these perspectives grew out of the research that Pratt and his associates were doing, so that it may be that's more of the language that the participants were using. Because he didn't start with these perspectives; they grew out of his research. But that's a good observation. That it's not just it. But I think social norms means, I think, norms within a professional setting as well. Not. Is that what you were referring to? Yeah. So what's the culture of whatever setting you're in, whether it's school or community or work? Yeah.
Sometimes we do different kinds of models of teaching depending on what class we're doing. If we're teaching at the lower level, we feel like there's a certain amount of background information that the students have to be getting out of the class. So we're doing some transitions. And then by the time the students are seniors, we're doing capstone, we're doing some research projects. Then we're doing something that's a lot more like an apprenticeship, or that looks at the student to develop a researcher. And when it comes to the classes that I've done in ethics, philosophy, and studies, we do a lot of social reform, environmental ethics, and public policy, ethics and public administration. So we're genuinely hoping that we're going to be raising a new generation of public administrators and voters and people who are going to be in dialogue with.
Great example. Context is everything. And I think one of the reminders of Pratt's work is it's about our, these are not really talking about methods. doesn't say anything about what methods you would be using. But it is getting underneath the sort of the invisibility aspect of what we do, and what are our beliefs and what are our intentions, and how well are those aligning with what course we're teaching, what program we're in. As we talk about designing programs or adapting programs to adult learners, what are we paying attention to, and what are we operating out of? When I take this teaching preference or perspectives inventory at least twice a year when I'm working with students, and I always come out the same, which is developmental with a bit of nurturing. But when I look at the scores, and it gives you some breakout in terms of what your beliefs are, and then what your intentions are in different settings. It just makes me pause and think a bit about: is this always the way that is developmental always the most appropriate driver? Depending on the setting I'm in. Would it be helpful if I were adopting more of a transmission approach if I were working with, let's say, novices, students who are just starting out to learn something?
What about the students who are coming back after maybe not even going to college, and they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s? You would have to consider them as a novice also. And so would it be by I can't figure out the word for this, circumstance on where they would be the novice and the expert, on circumstance on where they are in their life?
Well, that's interesting, because they're novice in terms of being a student in a college setting, right? If they haven't been raised to, you're going to go to college and everybody in our family goes to college, and they don't have many role models around them, then they're a novice in terms of coming into the educational system. They might be competent or proficient or even expert in doing something, in knowing about something, in supervising, in leading a congregation. So I think that's where the value of a prior learning assessment comes in some of the reflective work that we ask students to do, is to help them figure out where in their lives, what's new, what do they already bring that they have some competence in, and how do we help them translate that into the academic system? Because it's very, can be debilitating for adult students coming into this foreign thing called higher education, not knowing the language, not knowing how the systems work, and yet in other parts of their lives they have been quite successful. So how do we help them identify that? How do we touch that part of them? Did I get at your question at all?
I just wanted to describe and then have you quickly comment on an exercise that I've had adult students do at the outset, and this is in an online class. They read a piece about learner characteristics, that describes different learner characteristics, and then I just ask them, tell me about what are the learner characteristics, your learner characteristics that I should take into account when I teach this class. And that does two things. It makes them think about those, but it also gives them an idea, like, you'd actually take that into consideration. And it seems to have been a good opening exercise.
Yeah, I think that's a great exercise. I wanted to just segue it quickly over to, we talk about learning, and learning is one of those concepts that you could look in the literature, and there's umpteen definitions of learning. And the one the really concise one I like is that learning is a process of seeking meaning in experience. And when we're dealing with adult learners, I can't think of anything more fitting than experience and meaning making. That's what our educational enterprise is about, essentially. And for adults who bring in usually rich and varied experiences, goodness knows they're dealing with complex problems in real life. We don't have to make those up for them. The meaning that they're going to make is often contextual. Is this family? Is this work? Is this inter-family dynamics? Is it my children? Is it their local councils? So they've got so many, they've got multiple responsibilities. So they bring such rich and varied experience to our institutions. And if learning is about seeking meaning, then how are we set up to help that happen in effective ways? I'm starting to move a little bit into areas of theory because the constructivist approach, familiar with constructivism? Developmental constructivism, basically, and Sandra and people at this table can help me out with that. It's basically that people are constructing their own knowledge, their own truth with a small t, individually and with other people. So that our adult students are constantly constructing knowledge and with other people in community, and that process can sometimes lead to it can be transformative. It can change perspectives. It can change ways of seeing the world. It can change behaviors. It can change whole person. And I think that's what Sandra was alluding to a little earlier about the potential of working with adult students, regardless of what our subject matter might be. Because these are, most of our adult students, no matter what they say when they come in, oh, I have to be here because I need to get this degree, or I need to advance, I need to hold on to my job, or I need to get another job, all of that's true. But my experience, most of them are also coming to be hungry for this. And they want help, and how do I do that? I like Jack Mesro's work, he's a big guru in transformative learning. And his notion of learning has to do with that you've got your body of experience and how so we're interpreting prior experience, and as we learn something new or we encounter something new, we either are going to revise what we understood to be what we understood, or we're going to change it. So we're building on prior of our experience. We're building on prior interpretation of our experience. As we encounter something new, then we're either going to revise our previous interpretation, or we're going to create a new one, and we're going to use that to guide future action. So Mesro talks about learning as not just gaining knowledge, but using knowledge and the way of learning to guide future action, and that's very much in line with John Dewey's work, the seminal education philosopher who changed my life when I was in graduate school. I didn't know those kinds of ideas existed. So I think when we're talking about, somebody said being student-centered and learning-centered, when we're learning-centered, our emphasis is going to be on the characteristics of the learners. Who are they? What, in your question to the student, who are you, and why does it matter to you? Yeah, and how does that connect? It's a great question. And then the learning process. How do people interpret events and ideas? How are they seeking meaning? And how do they construct meaning-making structures? So sometimes you're teaching them a whole variety of different ways of making meaning or knowing structures. Could be through research methods. It could be through design principles. This is learning-centered. What's not on this list is the content and subject matter. What's not on this list is a lot of focus on the teacher per se. Questions, comments, disagreements? Okay. Let me start with your questions about either your questions about theories about adult learning and development or theories that you know and are working with that you would like to make sure the rest of us know about. Let's start with what you already are familiar with. Anybody? Favorite authors, favorite ideas that you think might be part of adult learning, or is this new?
I think the favorite here is the law. That goes back, as though we go back to meaning, we go back to the development itself, we go to sitting beside the learner, and one of the law's understandings is caring. You can interpret that as nurturing in adult education, and also that we as facilitators of learning, as mentors, can work with that student to take that student as far as that student would like to go. That it's individualized.
So if you're in, yes.
The authors who I'm about to share are not known for their work in adult learning, but they do a lot of work around organizational change. Okay. And I think that, for me, is one of the biggest impediments to adult learning. The first authors are Sue and Sue, and they wrote an article about organizational multicultural competence and how the organization has changed when we introduce new ideas, new thoughts, and I think that with adult learning, we still see so many universities wanting to get on the bandwagon, but sometimes the efforts aren't successful because we have not really fully addressed our own competence as it relates to dealing with other folks. And the other suggestion that I would have is looking at some of the first-person authors of the students who we're going to work with. What do we know about soldiers and some of their deployments in the returning military family? I think sometimes those are the best voices who don't get heard. They don't get heard.
And the authors, how does oh. And the other, you're talking about personal narrative?
Personal narrative. Mm-hmm.
Good. Other, when I think about well, you made a good point about adult learning theory and especially adult learning theory. There is no unified adult learning theory. It's informed by philosophy, psychology, biology, and neuroscience. So many disciplines are feeding into the theories on adult learning that looking at Sharon Merriam is one who writes these really co-edits, these nice pithy new directions for adult continuing education. So she had the update on adult learning theory, then she has the new update in adult learning theory, then she has the third update in adult learning theory, and then she has learning in adulthood, big text. Now she's on edition number 3. Each source talks about some of the pillars of adult learning theory, concepts such as, in some of the ones that relate most to this notion of seeking meaning and experience would be David Kolb's work on experiential learning. And how many of you are familiar with David Kolb? Okay. And sometimes we know David Kolb because of his work with learning styles, the 4 types of learning styles. But his work goes deeper than that, and he has a theory of learning from experience that is about our adaptability. How adaptive are learners to different situations, and he talks about these dimensions of complexity: the affective, how our feelings, the symbolic or our cognitive understanding, perceptual, how we see things, and then behavioral, what we do. And he said these are the adaptive modes, and that as people learn and develop, ideally all 4 are clicking in, and you're making progress in all 4 areas. But it's more likely that in any given course or learning situation, maybe 2 are really involved. So that the learning experience may have had a highly emotional or affective effect. And when we talk about personal narrative, we talk about students writing learning journals, reflective journals, things of that sort. We're often tapping into the affective side. And Kolb would say, to be effective, it would be well to have at least one other of those dimensions involved, if not all 4. So we're not just talking about the feelings, but we're able to look at those in terms of, well, perhaps that brought about some behavior change, or I came to see an issue in a whole different light, and I'm changing my view of that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Wrote the book on reflection and critical thinking, and James Zull, Z-U-L-L, ran with that and brought it into the arena of neuroscience and how we critically reflect. Our need for self-reflection, and then he brought it home in the area of creativity, is his area of abstract thinking and creativity, which is a very high form of being able to learn and create knowledge. And Zoll also talked about meaning. When you have learning is seeking meaning and experience, and it has to be meaningful. Our learning has to be meaningful to us. Otherwise, it's not going to go into long-term learning. It's not. We're not going to certainly not understand it, but we're going to forget about it. Actually, it's going to go into short-term memory, and then we are going to lose it. So, if we don't teach to meaning and the why, our students are not going to be able to even reflect on it, because it's not going to start to go into that long-term memory.
Useful when I actually taught a master's class in adult education, and it was by Stephen Brookfield, and it was a skillful teacher. And there's 2 chapters of that book that I thought was very informative. I think the first chapter, when it talks about the actual educator and what some of the things that the educator needs to know in teaching students. And the thing that I found funny about it is that he started off by saying, all these 10 theories that you've learned in college and all that, as soon as you get into the classroom, throw it all out the window. But you won't use any of that when you get into a teaching environment. Also, I like the chapter that dealt with culture and with the adult learner, and saying that, in teaching students, you may have a student who comes from a culture that doesn't promote education. Right. So now that person has got into the education arena, love it, want to go back and share it with their friends. What happens when you go back to their culture and it doesn't support education? What things that the facilitator can do with that student to kind of keep them engaged in the learning process without having to be so intimidated and going back to their environment and sharing what they've learned.
Okay. Yeah. Brookfield is a prolific writer and one of the leaders in the adult education arena. He's written about critical thinking, about the skillful teacher. More recently, he's been writing about race theory and critical theory and critical race theory, which connects with the social reform aspect of Pratt, which is basically looking at taking a really hard critique at the assuming that there's oppression and that the isms, sexism, classism, all those isms are alive and well in our structures, intentionally or not, and that it is incumbent upon us to be constantly diligent about looking for those. And your comment about our adult students coming in through so many different pathways to education, and for some of them it is like coming to a new land. And us, it's something they started, they're familiar with it, it's time to come back. But that we really need to be very careful about looking at our assumptions and our practices. Yeah, thank you for that. Other theories or theorists that I've found quite relevant to working with adult learners. Delos around the whole mentoring and care. Zoll, who has written about, he's taken David Kolb's learning cycle and related it to the development of the brain and how sort of that intersection of the cortex. And noon luncheon speaker Sandra Johnson is going to give you a much more coherent view of the theories and their implications for advising and mentoring. So this is kind of a teaser for some of what she's going to be doing. Transformative learning is a major body of work with adult learners. The notion that, especially with adults who come in with so much experience and interpretations of that experience and the world, that how do we both honor what they bring and help them learn new? And some of what they know might be wrong. So unlearning to do. And how do we help them, as Mesro talks about, confront disorienting dilemmas so that they need to question their beliefs and their assumptions and try on another way of looking at things. And there is the possibility of some kind of transformation taking place. And it might be a little transformation. They now understand their role in their family differently, or they have a different sense of their responsibility for environmental issues if they didn't before. We get down to Freire. Are people familiar with Paulo Freire? Yes. Brazilian educator, philosopher, and educator who began working with the oppressed people in Brazil to help them become aware. So his work on consciousness, raising conscious about awareness of their oppression and helping them to develop skills and perspectives where they were able to begin to assume more power or empowerment for their own lives and tie that very much into social reform and social justice. That is finding its way more and more into adult education. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as popular education. When I was first working with adult education in the early 1970s, we were very committed to reforming higher education. We had a much stronger social reform agenda than I am experiencing now, even in my own institution. So I think we go in cycles and in waves. But Prairie is still one of the major voices in that. Vygotsky, who's major contributor to the notion of social learning, is with adults especially. We tend to our interactive, social, learn with, learn in collaboration. And then we've already mentioned Brookfield. And on your gray sheet, when I put together suggested sources for my graduate students, it's about 8 pages long, single-spaced. So there's a lot of literature on adult learning and adult development. So what I've added here, and there are many important voices not on this list, ones that have done like handbooks of adult and continuing education or handbooks of adult learning and development, where you can find in one source a really good overview of many different approaches, so that if you're looking to become more familiar with the landscape of theory, some of these sources would be good places to go. If you're interested in, I'm going to be around today and tomorrow, so if you're interested in talking one-on-one, I'd be happy to hear more about your settings, and if there's theories and models that I might be able to suggest, or that you could do the same. Any takeaways from this morning?
I would just say that almost any theory that you can bring up, you can, for instance, Vygotsky, social learning. Adults learn, in that social setting. And yet, in a practical sense, when you're teaching a group of adults and tell them they have to work with each other, it drives them absolutely crazy. Right. Because there's a flip side to that, is that they're too busy. They have enough friends. They don't need another social group to be with. And yet, if they do it, then they find that it helps them to learn, or it tends to be a very positive experience. And so I'm not saying that I would just say that you can take any of the theories of what works, and you'll find flip side on practical where it does not work. Well, I have a confession to make about that, because I don't do group projects anymore, because it just drives the students crazy, and they don't have time to do it outside of class that well, or there's 2 people who end up doing the work. So what I've been doing instead is having consultant groups, so each student is still doing his or her own project, and then has 2 other people, or however many other people, who have responsibility for providing feedback. But that can be done online, and we take some time in class. So they're collaborating. They're also getting the chance to actually try on the criteria that you understand the criteria? Oh yes. So I've been doing it that way, because I think that it does still get at collaboration and learning together without the added, what I have found to be, burden of
the group project. Thank you. Yes?
Just briefly, looking at this orange chart here, we're looking at the novice/expert. I mentioned that I came back as an adult student myself some 20 years ago after spending 15 years in retail management. And I can see myself in exactly the spot, and so many of the students that I work with, I had 15 years of management experience, and I was good at that, and I knew a lot. And I walked into college, and I was like, where am I, and what's going on around here? I just didn't have any sense of what that academic setting was going to be like. And I think that's something we, really have to keep in mind, is that you have some people who are very, very good at whatever it is that they've been doing. And could in fact probably teach.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the whole idea of going to college is a whole new foreign experience.
Right.
We need to guide them into that.
Guide them in. Yeah.
And then hopefully with what we're talking about here with the credit is that we can maybe do something with that experience and, actually help them get college credit for that.
Right.
I think we're out of time.
I agree. So I think that, that goes back to the nurturing aspect from Pratt, and also then how do you take experience and knowledge that people bring in and help extend that, which is the developmental piece. Yeah. Well, we're at break, and thank you so much this morning. And, hope to